What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over the top waiver ads heading into week 14. Just a big congratulations out there to each and every one of you listening to this video. If you're listening to this video, then I am sure that you made the playoffs. So congratulations to you guys on that. Some of you may have a bye week. This could be win or go home for others of you out there. Just make sure that even if you don't need a player off of the waiver wire, you consider picking them up for a bench player with less value. The reason for that is to play keep away from some of your other opponents who may end up using one of these players against you, and that type of situation happens each and every year. Before we move over to stat of the day and jump more into the video, if I could just ask you guys, if we helped you at any point throughout this season to get to the playoffs, if you could just give this video a like, and if you're not subscribed, I don't know what you're thinking, hit that subscribe button. We're trying to at least pass 90K before we shut down for the season. If you guys could help us in accomplishing that goal, we would be very, very grateful. But like I said, let's move over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which quarterback currently has the worst completion rate while under pressure. The correct answer was actually Matthew Stafford. Congratulations to Donald Brown. You got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which wide receiver is currently playing on the highest percent of snaps? Once again, that's which wide receiver currently has the highest snap share percentage. Leave your answer in the comments section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado, let's hop right into the running backs. To start this list, you'll notice we have Ty Johnson, currently owned in 0% of leagues. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this is a massive upside pick, but in the short term, with Frank Gore injured, LaMichael Perriman still on IR, Ty Johnson is a player who can step in and perform as he did in week 13 for you in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. In week 13, Ty Johnson, he had 22 carries on the ground, was very efficient with his touches, and also notched in 2 receptions in the passing game. Now, I do believe he would have possibly had more receptions if the game was out of hand like it typically is with the New York Jets playing from behind, but in this one, they did have a lead for most of the game, but a positive sign to see him notch in 2 receptions nonetheless. Keep in mind though, his overall value is going to heavily rely on the health of the running backs ahead of him on the depth chart, that being both LaMichael Perriman as well as Frank Gore. If Perriman returns from IR or Frank Gore's injury is not as serious, if either of those 2 running backs play, the value for Ty Johnson is going to go right out the window. The next running back we have on this list is Cam Akers of the Los Angeles Rams. Cam Akers basically had his breakout performance in week 13 against the Arizona Cardinals. To some, it may seem a bit surprising. I will say the amount of volume he received was on the high end, but we have seen Cam Akers trending up over the past few weeks when it comes to involvement, being trusted on important snaps, and now the production came and followed suit. This past week, he had 22 overall touches, 94 total yards on the day, and even scored a touchdown on the ground. Now, I can't sit here and tell you he was all that efficient on his touches, but his efficiency is less important than his volume at this point. It was good to see him getting the bulk of the workload. Looking at the 2 other running backs in this offense, Darrell Henderson as well as Malcolm Brown, each of those 2 rushers only received 3 carries on the ground. If Cam Akers is going to move forward as the primary tailback in this offense, then he must be owned in all leagues, and at this point he's only owned in 35%. We're moving into the next running back, which is Adrian Peterson of the Detroit Lions. I have a feeling this is going to be a rusher who's going to be higher on some waiver lists and lower on others. We'll probably be smacked somewhere in the middle. Yes, Adrian Peterson is going to get an increased workload. There are injuries now to both Collin Johsnon as well as DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift out last week, but now Collin Johsnon, he sustained an injury in this past game as well. Adrian Peterson took full advantage, scoring 2 touchdowns on the ground, a feat that he has now accomplished in back-to-back weeks, so the value for him may be inflated based on production and now his increased potential workload. But the only issue I have with him, and the reason he doesn't rank higher on this list, it's just the fact that he gets absolutely no work done in the receiving game. One-dimensional rushers like that, the floor for them on a week-by-week basis, it's pretty low, so I definitely see him as a potential player who could hurt anybody who ends up starting him. I'm not saying he's guaranteed to fail or doesn't have the ability to produce. His next matchup matchup, of course, is against Green Bay, one of the weaker rushing defenses in the league, so there is some potential there. My only issue or concern is he's been very inefficient on the season. In 8 of his last 9 games, he's been sub 4 yards per carry. The only game in which he was able to eclipse 4 yards per carry, he only had 4 carries on the ground, so a very small sample size with that. The Detroit Lions themselves also aren't a very powerhouse offense. They're not heading into the second half with massive leads, which is going to impact a player that gets most of his production from the run game. Regardless, he's still a veteran player who's stepping into an increased opportunity share, and next week he is going to be facing a weak run defense, so there definitely are some endearing qualities. Behind him, we have James White of the New England Patriots, currently owned in 55% of leagues. PSA for you guys, if you are hurting at the running back position and have nobody to start in your first week of the fantasy playoffs, look for James White. I have a feeling he's going to be dropped in a lot of leagues. A lot of people, they're chasing that production. Obviously, we want our players to do well, but when looking at James White and his performance this past week, we kind of have to throw it out. The New England Patriots were facing the LA Chargers and won by a massive 45 points. They actually completely shut out the Chargers, making this game as big of a blowout as you possibly could see. As for James White, we know his role is primarily in the passing game, playing as the primary receiving back, and in a game where they're up 40 plus points, do you really expect that they're going to heavily utilize that position? No, it's going to be a much better game for players like Damian Harris, but that's not to say that there aren't better games for James White ahead. Those types of games could come as early as next week. In week 14, they face the LA Rams, who are very stingy on defense. In these tough defensive matchups, in order to move the ball up and down the field, the New England Patriots do rely on the passing attack to the backfield, and that's exactly the role for James White. Now, just because he didn't perform in this matchup, he'll probably find his way to waivers, so if you're a team who is desperate for a running back, one with a relatively safe floor, then I would definitely look in James White's direction. The next player on this list we can gloss over. He hasn't yet played, but that's Benny Snell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Snell is taking over for James Conner, who had been ruled out due to COVID, which is a factor that could come into play for next week as well. We're talking week 14 here. If James Conner does miss, Benny Snell, Anthony McFarland likely to split the work. Depending on how well Snell performs, you can move him up or down this list. Just know that it is more of a short-term rental. His value is going to be based mostly off handcuff value, because as soon as James Conner does return, he will thrust himself back into that starter role. So Benny Snell, he doesn't have much long-term value unless there's an injury to James Conner. For that, he's not going to rank higher on this list, but if he does come in and have a good performance, I would definitely bump him a bit up these waiver rankings. The final running back we have is Jamaal Williams of the Green Bay Packers, and I feel like people are already forgetting what happened to us in the early stages to the mid part of the season, where virtually almost every starting running back was already out with injury. We had to grab those handcuffs. Those handcuffs were our starters for several weeks, but it seems like for some people that is now a distant memory because they're forgetting and dropping these players. Jamaal Williams is a perfect example of that. Aaron Jones is an absolute stud. Anyone who owns Aaron Jones knows he is an auto start each and every week. If anything were to happen to Aaron Jones, your team, your roster, your starting lineup would definitely take a massive hit. So having a player, a safety net like Jamaal Williams on your bench, while it's not going to help you with the production in your starting lineup, it is going to provide your team much more safety deep into the playoffs. The Green Bay Packers have AJ Dillon, who was already ruled out last week. Dexter Williams, he is injured as well. So the depth chart for the running backs in this offense, it's extremely thin. So if anything were to happen to Aaron Jones, Jamaal Williams would be an absolute workhorse. Even with that factor though, I'm still seeing him dropped each and every week. I wouldn't be surprised to see his ownership percentage drop even after waivers clear on this Wednesday. So if you see Jamaal Williams dropped or available on your waiver wire, I would suggest you grab him even if you aren't the Aaron Jones owner. Alright guys, let's hop over to the wide receiver position. The top player is possibly the top player to add on the entire week. That's Keke Coutee of the Houston Texans. Keke Coutee did finish his game this past week against the Indianapolis Colts with 8 receptions for 141 yards, posting a wide receiver 1 finish. To some, this may seem out of the blue, but we definitely saw this coming with the suspension of Will Fuller, the injury to Randall Cobb. This really only left Brandon Cooks, Keke Coutee, and the tight ends to pick up the slack from the receiver positions. Considering this past week's matchup was against a very stingy pass defense in the Indianapolis Colts, those matchups typically favor the off receiver, the ones that run the short to intermediate routes, the slot type receivers, which is exactly the role of Keke Keke Coutee. Looking forward on the schedule, this week, in week 14, the Houston Texans will be facing Kyle Fuller and the Chicago Bears, which presents itself a very similar matchup to what we saw this past week. And then in week 15, they have a rematch against Indianapolis, the team that Keke Coutee just torched. This means Keke Coutee is likely going to step in and be a top 30 option right out of the gate, and considering he's a receiver that's only owned in 11% of leagues, a lot of you guys out there are able to nab him off your waivers this week. The next wide receiver we have is T.Y. Hilton, who's owned in sub 50% of leagues. He still may not be available for all of you out there, but he's definitely worth an add even if you don't intend on starting him. Playing keep away for a team that is desperate to fill a wide receiver position, it may be a good bet. T.Y. Hilton this past week had a whopping 11 targets, the highest amount of targets he'd received on the season. That's not to say though that that trend is going to continue. We had seen that he had double-digit targets at one point in the season, then posted some of his worst numbers in the following weeks after that. A similar type of situation could definitely happen. I still trust Michael Pittman to be the top receiving target in this offense long term, and even for the remainder of the season, which will of course be at the detriment of T.Y. Hilton. T.Y. Hilton though, he has caught a receiving touchdown in each of the last 2 games. If Phillip Rivers is realizing he can continue to trust him, then the opportunities and the workload will increase from this point forward. That remains to be determined though, but one thing is for sure, he should be owned in all leagues at this point. The next receiver on this list is Allen Lazard of the Green Bay Packers, and when it comes to Allen Lazard, the ceiling for him, it's a bit low week over week. We know that this passing offense runs through Davante Adams. That's not to say though that he can't have starter level production for you deep down the stretch. Even as early as this week in week 14, he faces Detroit, which is one of the weaker pass defenses in the entire league. Aaron Rodgers should have a field day at tearing up that passing defense, so a player like Allen Lazard definitely has a higher ceiling in that one than he typically would. His floor, it's relatively safe week over week. He has of course cemented himself as the primary receiver behind Davante Adams. Even a player like Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who was on an absolute tear before Lazard did return from injury, he has had a combined 2 targets over the last 2 weeks. A clear indication that Allen Lazard is the player moving forward, and with a matchup against Detroit in week 14, a matchup against Tennessee in week 16, who just got torn apart by Baker Mayfield, the potential and upside for Lazard is the highest we've seen since the beginning part of the season. The next 2 receivers we can basically combine. It's Denzel Mims and Breshad Perriman. While yes, Jamison Crowder had himself another wide receiver 1 performance this week, we cannot forget and cannot deny the fact that both Breshad Perriman and Denzel Mims have been the players that have been trending up the most. Breshad Perriman, the most productive receiver, Denzel Mims, the receiver with the most volume, both players that do potentially have startable value. As we know, the New York Jets are one of the worst teams in the NFL. They're playing from behind in almost each and every game, and in those types of situations, the passing volume, the garbage time volume is always high in the second half of the game. That benefits the wide receivers like Mims, Crowder, and Perriman, and seeing Sam Darnold actually look competent on offense gives us a little bit to be hopeful for in the coming weeks. The final receiver we have is the receiver out of Jacksonville. It's Collin Johsnon, a player who we added to the list last week. It seems as though Mike Glennon and Collin Johsnon, they do have some chemistry built up. Collin Johsnon in week 13 ranked 2nd on the team in targets, just behind DJ Chark. DJ Chark had 7 targets. Collin Johsnon just 1 target less at 6, but even the uber talented DJ Chark only converted 2 of his 7 targets into receptions. Collin Johsnon showed much better chemistry, converting 4 of 6. And Laviska Shenault, a player who did catch a receiving touchdown in this past contest, that target wasn't even meant for him. It bounced off of a defender, ended up finding its way to the end zone exactly where Laviska Shenault was. A fluky play to say the least, but when it comes to Laviska Shenault, this is also a player that now has injury concerns as well. There were some x-rays done after the game. The report we've received is that those x-rays came back negative. If Laviska Shenault does miss any time, the opportunity share for Collin Johsnon could increase even more from what we currently see. As it stands right now, he seems to be the receiver on pace to be either 1st or 2nd on this team in targets. The connection with him, he should be more efficient on his targets from what we've seen so far as well. So Collin Johsnon, for desperate owners out there, could definitely be a player that fills a role for your team. Alright guys, we're moving over to the tight end position. There are a few names in here that we don't typically have. The top 2 tight ends, Dalton Schultz and Jordan Reed, they have not played yet. Their value off of the waiver wire really isn't going to be all that impacted based on their 1-game performance though, barring injury of course, but their value is going to be based off their rest of season schedule. We're looking at weeks 14 through 16 here. looking at Dalton Schultz. In week 14, he plays the Cincinnati Bengals, who are one of the worst defenses at defending opposing tight ends, so he definitely has startability as early as this upcoming week. As for Jordan Reed, who's only owned in 15% of leagues, he has two soft matchups in weeks 14 and 15, where he plays the Washington football team and the Dallas Cowboys, two matchups that are easily beatable. So long as George Kittle does not return from his injury, Jordan Reed could be a name thrown into a hat that you could potentially start throughout the entire playoff series. The next tight end we have is a new name here. It's Anthony Firkser of the Tennessee Titans. Big news here in this one is that Jonnu Smith, he didn't practice all last week, was ruled out. The result was Anthony Firkser taking over as the main tight end in this passing offense. As the starter, Anthony Firkser put up pretty solid numbers: 7 targets, 5 receptions, 51 receiving yards. We do have to take that a bit with a grain of salt. This was against Cleveland, the team that ranks dead last at defending opposing tight ends. This was also a game in which they were playing from behind for the entire game, so we can't say with certainty that this volume or production is going to continue week over week. What he does have working in his benefit, though, is that this team did just lose AJ Brown. With the loss of AJ Brown, that is going to open up more opportunities in the passing game, more volume to go around, and Anthony Firkser being a consistent producer when his number's called, there is a good shot that he does see increased opportunities as a result. In week 14, he faces the Jacksonville Jaguars, who rank in the bottom 10 at defending opposing fantasy tight ends, so he has startability as early as week 14 and beyond. The next tight end is definitely more of a desperation play. Maybe if you lost a tight end due to injury, have been streaming the position, Drew Sample is definitely a name you could throw out there. In week 13, against a pretty stingy Miami defense as of late, he had a whopping 7 targets, converted all 7 of those targets into receptions, so the chemistry between him and the new quarterback, it is proving to be a bit fruitful. Looking at his remaining schedule, there's only one game that you really should be avoiding starting him if you don't have better options, and that would be against Pittsburgh. The other 2 matchups against Dallas and Houston in weeks 14 and 16 are easily beatable. They rank middle to back of the league at defending tight ends. The final tight end we have is Will Dissley of the Seattle Seahawks. Similarly to Drew Sample, this is definitely more of a deeper league play, a desperation play, but Will Dissley definitely has the chops to produce for you in the playoffs. As we know, Greg Olsen, the previous tight end starter on this team, he is out with injury, paving the way for Will Dissley to lead this team from that position. The final 3 matchups for Will Dissley, weeks 14 through 16, not one of them is going to be a super difficult matchup. The matchup that you should get most excited for is probably the week 14 matchup against the New York Jets. The Jets rank near dead last at defending opposing fantasy tight ends. We just saw what Darren Waller was able to do to that team, posting one of the best tight end performances we had seen in years. 13 receptions, a massive 200 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns to go along with it. If that's any indication at how poor the Jets will be at defending opposing fantasy tight ends in week 14, Will Dissley has a ton of upside, but will come with a ton of risk as well. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.